In the complex geopolitical landscape of the Russo-Ukrainian War, Georgia finds itself navigating treacherous waters. As a small nation caught between powerful neighbors and competing interests, its decisions are scrutinized by both Western allies and Russian authorities. The recent wave of pressure from the West for Georgia to take a more active stance against Russia highlights the delicate balance the Georgian government must maintain in a time of escalating tensions. Following Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the US and European governments urged Georgia to open a second front against Russia, a call met with hesitation from the Georgian leadership. In response to their reluctance, Western sources labeled the Georgian government as pro-Russia, leading to sanctions against several key officials. The roots of this pressure can be traced back to the strategic significance of Georgia, which shares a border with Russia and has a complex history with the Kremlin, particularly regarding its breakaway regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Following the 2022 invasion, Georgian officials reported that the Biden administration and European allies had privately encouraged them to assist Ukraine militarily. This included discussions about guerrilla tactics to draw Russian troops away from Ukraine, exploiting Georgia's geographical closeness to the North Caucasus. However, Georgia's government, led by the Georgian Dream Party, resisted these overtures. The current president and prime minister have voiced concerns regarding the potential repercussions of provoking Russia, especially given the proximity of Russian troops to the capital, Tbilisi. This precarious situation is exacerbated by the influence of Bidzina Ivanishvili, a billionaire and the so-called power behind the throne of the Georgian Dream Party. Ivanishvili has faced U.S. sanctions for undermining Georgia's democratic aspirations, which adds another layer of complexity to the government's position. His significant investments in public infrastructure have garnered him local support, complicating the narrative of Georgia's political alignment. As the war continues, the internal opposition in Georgia has been vocal, advocating for the government to provide military assistance to Ukraine. The European Parliament has condemned the Georgian Dream government for its perceived democratic backsliding, calling for sanctions against its officials and urging a reduction of trade with Russia. However, the Georgian government has pushed back against these demands, emphasizing its economic reliance on Russia for trade, tourism, and remittances, factors that are crucial as Georgia grapples with an economic crisis characterized by high unemployment and significant outward migration. Amid these tensions, demonstrations have erupted in Tbilisi, driven by opposition claims of electoral fraud and a perceived shift away from European integration towards closer ties with Russia. The protests have garnered international attention, and while many call for stronger action against Russia, the government remains cautious, aware that any drastic actions could provoke a military response from Moscow. Georgia's government maintains that it remains committed to its aspirations of joining the EU and NATO despite the ongoing occupation of its territories by Russia. The Georgian Dream Party has pointed to its efforts in supporting Ukraine, including humanitarian aid and diplomatic initiatives. However, the underlying fear is that Western demands could inadvertently endanger Georgia's stability and security, pushing it closer to Russian aggression. As the global landscape continues to evolve, Georgia's role as a connector country between East and West is more critical than ever. The government must navigate its relationships with both Western powers and Russia while fostering its domestic stability. The challenge lies in resisting the pressures to become a pawn in a larger geopolitical contest, focusing instead on building a sustainable strategy that leverages its unique position. Looking ahead, it is clear that Georgia's path will not be straightforward. The international community's response to Georgia's balancing act will play a significant role in shaping the future of this small but strategically significant nation. Whether it can maintain its sovereignty and pursue its aspirations while managing external pressures remains a question that will define its future in the coming years. As the conflict in Ukraine continues to escalate, the geopolitical implications are reverberating through international politics, with significant developments emerging from both the battlefield and diplomatic arenas. This past week, former U.S. President Donald Trump voiced his frustrations regarding the ongoing war, particularly targeting Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and the intricacies of a controversial minerals deal that Trump claims Zelensky is attempting to renegotiate. This accusation reflects broader tensions surrounding the war as the U.S. seeks to balance support for Ukraine with its own economic interests. During a conversation with NBC News, Trump expressed his anger towards Russian President Vladimir Putin's recent insinuations questioning Zelensky's legitimacy as Ukraine's leader. "I'm angry and pissed off at Putin for disparaging Zelensky," Trump stated, emphasizing that if there is no progress toward a ceasefire, he is prepared to impose substantial secondary sanctions on Russian oil. This includes a proposed 25% tariff on all Russian oil, which Trump insists will affect any companies or nations that continue to engage in business with Russia. His remarks underscore the complexities of U.S.-Russia relations and the potential ramifications for global energy markets. Meanwhile, the Kremlin is ramping up its rhetoric, with Russian officials suggesting a need for a temporary international administration in Ukraine, a move seen as a thinly veiled demand for regime change. Kirill Logvinov, Russia's permanent representative to the European Union, outlined a plan for the United Nations to oversee a transition in power within Ukraine which would allow Russia to retain significant influence over the process. This proposal was swiftly rejected by UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, who reaffirmed the legitimacy of Ukraine's government, highlighting the ongoing impasse in negotiations. The conflict has also seen intensified military actions, particularly in Kharkiv, where Russian forces reportedly targeted both a military hospital and civilian infrastructure. The Ukrainian Air Force reported the downing of numerous drones amid ongoing assaults, illustrating the relentless nature of the conflict. Notably, the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense announced the establishment of a new space policy department aiming to strengthen Ukraine's capabilities in satellite technology and enhance its defense strategies, further indicating a shift toward innovative military solutions in the face of persistent aggression. As the war approaches its 1,131st day, both sides continue to engage in operations across various fronts, with Ukraine maintaining defensive stances while Russia attempts to push forward in eastern Ukraine. Reports suggest that Russian forces have made minor advances in key areas, though significant breakthroughs remain elusive. In this complex landscape, the interplay of military strategy, international diplomacy, and economic sanctions will undoubtedly shape the course of the conflict. As Trump prepares to engage with Putin in forthcoming discussions, the world watches closely, anticipating whether this dialogue might pave the way for a ceasefire or if it will further entrench the divisions that have characterized this prolonged struggle. Looking ahead, the need for robust diplomatic engagement remains critical, not only to halt the fighting but to establish a framework for lasting peace in the region. In a dramatic shift in tone, U.S. President Donald Trump has expressed his frustration towards Russian President Vladimir Putin, stating he is very angry and pissed off over the stalled ceasefire negotiations in Ukraine. This sentiment was articulated during an NBC News interview where Trump criticized Putin for undermining Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's credibility and threatened significant economic consequences if progress is not made. 4 weeks. Trump has been under scrutiny for his seemingly accommodating stance toward Putin, prompting concerns among European leaders. However, his recent comments suggest a newfound assertiveness in U.S. foreign policy regarding Russia. "You could say that I was very angry when Putin started getting into Zelensky's credibility. That's not going in the right location," Trump stated, emphasizing his dissatisfaction with the Russian leader's remarks. In a bold move, Trump warned that failure to secure a ceasefire could lead to secondary tariffs of up to 50% on Russian oil, targeting countries that continue to purchase it, a strategy primarily aimed at China and India, the largest buyers of Russian oil. "If Russia and I are unable to make a deal on stopping the bloodshed in Ukraine, I am going to put secondary tariffs on all oil coming out of Russia," Trump declared, indicating that these tariffs would take effect within a month if negotiations falter. The backdrop to these tensions is a complex web of diplomatic maneuvers. Recently, Putin floated the idea of a UN-run government in Ukraine to facilitate elections, a proposal that has not been well received by Zelensky. Trump's comments come at a time when Ukraine is under immense pressure to agree to a minerals deal with the U.S., critical for military aid continuation and aimed at securing valuable resources such as rare earth metals. Despite his frustrations, Trump noted that he has maintained a very good relationship with Putin, suggesting that their dialogue could quickly resume if the situation improves. The Kremlin has acknowledged Trump's anger but remains open to further contacts, stating that a phone call could be arranged at short notice if deemed necessary. The ongoing conflict, now entering its fourth year, has seen devastating losses on both sides. Over 100,000 Russian military personnel have reportedly died since the full-scale invasion began in February 2022, while Ukrainian officials put their military casualties at around 43,000, though many analysts believe this figure is an understatement. As the war continues, the humanitarian crisis worsens, with millions of Ukrainians displaced and the prospect of valid elections rendered nearly impossible. The situation is further complicated by recent Russian attacks on Ukrainian cities, including Kharkiv, which underscore the ongoing volatility in the region. With Trump's aggressive rhetoric and threats of economic sanctions, the stakes are high as both sides navigate a treacherous diplomatic landscape. As the U.S. continues to redefine its approach to Russia, all eyes will be on the upcoming discussions surrounding rare earth metals and the potential for renewed negotiations. The coming weeks will be critical in determining whether Trump's anger translates into meaningful progress or if it exacerbates the already fraught relations between the U.S. and Russia, as well as the broader geopolitical landscape surrounding the Ukraine conflict. In a dramatic escalation of rhetoric and military action, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has called for tough measures against Russia, emphasizing the need for increased pressure on President Vladimir Putin to reach a ceasefire agreement. This plea comes in the wake of ongoing long-range strikes from Moscow that demonstrate a blatant disregard for diplomatic efforts aimed at ending the three-year conflict between the two nations. Zelensky's remarks came during a Sunday evening address, where he expressed frustration over the continued violence despite U.S.-mediated attempts to establish a ceasefire. The geography and brutality of Russian strikes, not just occasionally but literally every day and night, show that Putin couldn't care less about diplomacy, he stated. He reported a surge in drone strikes affecting 7 Ukrainian regions, underscoring the urgency for the international community to act decisively. While both Kiev and Moscow had previously agreed to freeze attacks in the Black Sea and on energy infrastructure, accusations of violations have flown between the two sides. Zelensky noted that more strikes and shelling that have occurred, suggesting that Russia's military actions are a direct rebuke to the prospect of peace talks. He argued for the necessity of sanctions against Russia and an increase in air defense for Ukraine, asserting that more cooperation and unity among all partners is essential. Complicating the situation, President Donald Trump expressed his own frustrations on the same day, targeting both Putin and Zelensky in a series of comments that reflect the tangled dynamics of U.S. foreign policy in the region. Trump voiced his anger at Putin's recent criticism of Zelensky, who the Russian leader claimed lacks legitimacy in negotiating a peace deal. "I was very angry," Trump remarked, highlighting the paradox of his position as he seeks to mediate while simultaneously criticizing both leaders. Trump suggested he would consider imposing new sanctions on Russia, particularly focused on its lucrative oil exports, which are critical to the Russian economy. He identified China and India as significant customers of Russian oil and hinted at potential repercussions for nations continuing to purchase it. Notably, Trump has maintained a complex relationship with Putin, often oscillating between criticism and camaraderie. "I've known him for a long time," Trump stated, expressing a belief that Putin would ultimately honor any agreements made. As the conflict intensifies, the prospect of a ceasefire appears increasingly bleak. On Monday, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov reiterated that Putin remains open to discussions with Trump, but no formal communication is currently scheduled. Meanwhile, Russian drone attacks persist, with a recent assault targeting civilian infrastructure in Ukraine raising concerns about a fresh military offensive aimed at further pressuring Kyiv. Amidst these developments, Trump's comments also touched on Zelensky's efforts to renegotiate a minerals deal with the U.S., which had been set to enhance cooperation on Ukraine's critical resources. Trump warned of big problems for Zelensky if he attempts to back out of the agreement, emphasizing the geopolitical stakes involved in Ukraine's accession to NATO and the European Union. As tensions mount, the international community watches closely, aware that the outcomes of these political maneuvers and military actions will have broad implications not just for Ukraine and Russia but for global security and diplomatic relations. The question remains whether diplomatic avenues can yield tangible results or if the cycle of violence will continue unabated. As the conflict evolves, it is clear that both internal and external pressures are shaping the decisions of the involved parties, making the path to peace more complex than ever.